Hi, everybody. I am Frani Rollins, and this is Tips for Reading Out Loud. So the first thing that we want to do is do a practice video. Record yourself saying whatever you want to say, and then listen to it, because you may have a fan or you may have some noise or a TV in the background that you didn't notice before. Once you actually watch yourself and listen to yourself, you'll hear all of those things. And so you can get rid of some of those noises in the background that you were not expecting just from that first practice recording. The next thing you want to work on is your breathing and your air. Sometimes when we get very nervous, we tend to speed up our talking and we have run-on sentences and we don't breathe very well, and nobody really understands where sentences start and end, and we take breaths in the middle of things, and that's not what we want when we're reading. When we're reading, we want to make sure that we take breaths at the beginning and end of sentences, and on longer sentences, we want to make sure that we take breaths at the commas. This makes it so the people watching and listening to your video understand what you're saying and can follow the story. One of the things you can do on your first practice read is to read it out loud and see if you can get through each of the full sentences with one breath. If you ever feel like you were running out of breath at the end of a sentence, look at that sentence, find a place where you need to take a breath, and then practice that sentence, taking that breath at the perfect moment. A great example is from a book that I have on my desk here. The sentence goes, "Maggie started walking again, period. She saw a gnome polishing mushroom furniture, a tree nymph stepping out of a tree, and paw prints where a wolf had passed by." By the end of that sentence, I get a little out of breath because I don't stop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop at the period and take a breath, and then I'm going to stop and take a breath at that comma. And you'll kind of see I get through all of those sentences kind of with a full bit of breath. So Maggie started walking again. She saw a gnome polishing mushroom furniture, a tree nymph stepping out of a tree, and paw prints where a wolf had passed by. And what you can see is from the first time and the second time I read that, that sentence is powerful all the way through, as opposed to me kind of just fading out at the end. So make sure that you, when you read your book, find those places where you can breathe, whether it naturally happens at the periods or at the commas, or if you need to go through and find those places that work best for you. The next thing we want to look at is pacing. Very similarly to when we first get on film, we tend to speak really quickly or we tend to speak very slowly. If there are areas that we feel less confident about, we tend to kind of mumble over and kind of speed up. Same thing when it comes to different voices. When it comes to dialogue, a lot of the time we'll get tripped up and we'll kind of slow down. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to really think about your pacing and making sure that as you're reading through the story, you are kind of following in the same energy with all of the words as you go. The best way to kind of figure this out, if you are looking at a book that has similar word counts on each page, is to read a page and time yourself, and then read the second page and time yourself. And if you are hitting about the same time, you know that your pacing on each page is pretty good. If you're doing a much longer book, when you do your practice video, time yourself in one of the earlier pages. And then as you get toward the end of the book, time yourself again and see if you're speeding up or slowing down. And that will help you correct as you need to when it comes to your pacing while you read your book. One other tip that I always like to mention when people are talking, not only on film, but when we're talking about theater as well, is when we are enunciating our words, one thing that we get tripped up on a lot are things that have double consonants. So a great example of this is if you're talking about your grandpa drinking a can of soda, and the text said something like Gramps soda can. A lot of the times what we will say is we'll say Gramps soda can, and we will lose that second S. So we'll tie the S at the end of Gramps to the S at the start of soda, and it becomes one S. But when we are reading and when we are reciting, we want to make sure that each of those consonants kind of gets its own space. So as opposed to Gramps soda can, I did it naturally, sorry. As opposed to Gramps soda can, we want to make sure we say Gramps soda can, and really make sure you leave that space for both of those S's, and with any of those spaces where we have double consonants. One of the fun things about reading out loud is that sometimes we get the opportunity to do voices and speak for different characters, which is awesome. You may choose not to do different voices, which is totally okay. But if you do choose to do voices, there are a couple of things that we do with voice acting that might help you to kind of enhance your performance in a way. The first one is to, when you do those practice reads, look at and get comfortable with who says what at each moment. If you know, for instance, in a particular book, if I'm looking at my Pinkalicious text here, on this page, we see that the main character, Pinkalicious, says, "Now there really is such thing as a pink dog." And then later on at the bottom, Peter says, "Ew." So if I know that on this page, that's kind of what happens, I can think about if I want to have specific voices for each character, and I can kind of make a decision about how I want to do that. So one great way to kind of differentiate voices is to think about your natural voice when you're reading. And so for me, this is kind of the natural where I land. And if I want to maybe take, for example, kind of a younger girl voice, I might just raise my voice up a little bit. So when I'm reading Pinkalicious's lines, my voice kind of lives up here. And maybe if I'm talking about Peter, her brother, maybe what I might do is I might drop my voice a little bit. So Pinkalicious is up here and Peter is down here. And when I'm actually reading the text, my voice lives here. It's not a huge difference, but it does help kind of differentiate some of those characters. So for example, without the voice change, I told my family what happened. Now there really is such a thing as a pink dog, I said. Pinky licked Peter in the face. Ew, said Peter. Now, if I just change my voice a little bit, it sounds like, I told my family what happened. Now there really is such a thing as a pink dog, I said. Pinky licked Peter in the face. Ew, said Peter. Again, not that big of a difference, but when you're reading out loud, sometimes finding those is really nice for your audience. So feel free to kind of choose whether it's a higher voice or it's a lower voice, or if it's something maniacal and being able just to kind of make your voice a little scratchy, making sure that you kind of have those lined up for all of your characters can really make it fun. Now, one of the things we want to be mindful of is that sometimes we like to choose accents for some of our characters. And this is a great option sometimes, but you want to be very mindful of the intent. Why are you choosing the accent and what are people going to get from that accent? If you're unsure if it's an appropriate accent to take for that character, please make sure that you do a little bit of research on linguistic racism to make sure that you are choosing something that's appropriate for the reading that you're doing. Hopefully, with whatever choices you make with your voices, it turns out great.